Hi folks. Well, before I start the lecture here, I would like to ask a question of you and have you answer that question in a poll. The question is, what is the most consumed protein on Earth? What protein by mass is consumed more than any other protein on Earth? So the choices are beef, soy, in various forms as soybean, etc., tofu, chicken, gluten, pork, or milk protein. Which of those 6 protein sources, beef, soy, chicken, gluten, pork, or milk, is the most consumed protein on Earth? So stop the video right now and go answer that question on the poll, and then come back and resume the lecture here, and I'll answer the question for you. Thanks. Okay. The answer is, drumroll, to the question of what is the most consumed protein on Earth amongst beef, soy, chicken, gluten, pork, or milk. It's gluten, by far. So about 61% of the protein consumed on Earth comes from plants, and most of that protein is actually in the form of gluten. The second is milk at about 10%, so only a sixth of the amount. Beef is only 5%. That's only a fifth. Pork, there's actually a little bit more pork and poultry consumed on Earth than beef. And then eggs and various seafoods and other animal products make up some small percentages as well. So gluten, okay? That's a good introduction for Lecture 13, Rootin' for Gluten. I'm here to perhaps dispel a few of the myths around this protein and talk about how important this protein is for feeding Earth's population. First, let's find out what it is. So, gluten itself is a combination of 2 proteins that are found in wheat, gliadin and glutenin, and in other cereal grains such as rice, etc. So the gliadin and glutenin, plus water combine to form gluten. And the glutenin is a coiled, springy structure. It's a filamentous protein that has a sort of long, coiled, springy structure. This is what gives gluten its elasticity. Like when you knead dough and you stretch it, it's real stretchy. That's because of the glutenin. The gliadin is a globular protein. That is what gives gluten its strength. So when you pull pizza dough, it resists you pulling it, and when you bake it, it holds together. It's nice and firm. That is because of the gliadin. The word gluten itself comes from the Latin for glue. So wheat paste was used as sort of the earliest glue, and the word has come down throughout the ages and is what we refer to when we talk about the elasticity, the elastic component of dough. So looking at the diagram on the right-hand side, we see the proteins in dry wheat, the long filamentous coiled structure of the glutenin, and then these little squiggles, these dots, these squiggle bunches, those are the gliadin. When we add water to it and we hydrate those proteins, it begins to form gluten. The strands of the glutenin are going to begin to hydrogen bond with one another, and the gliadin is going to is going to stick to the strands of glutenin, and when we add salt, that can further enable these these hydrogen bonds and the alignment between the strands of the glutenin. Normally, the parts of these proteins don't really like interacting with water. There are hydrophobic components in these proteins, and because of that, the proteins are going to stick together with one another in the same way that oil droplets come together in a glass of water. If you were to drop some oil in a water, all the little drops will coalesce because of the hydrophobic forces. This is what drives the gliadin to associate with the hydrophobic parts of the glutenin that are revealed when the water begins to tear the protein apart, the water and the salt during dough formation. So let's look at some microscope images, some close-up images of this gluten formation. So in the left-hand column here, we see this protein network of the glutenin fibers that's formed after we add the water, and don't really mix it up. We've just added the water to the gluten, but there hasn't been a lot of stretching. There normally would be starch granules that are embedded in the holes here of the glutenin, but we've removed them by washing them away in this image so that we can see the meshy network of the gluten formation. When we begin to knead the dough, those protein strands from the glutenin begin to stretch, and as they stretch, they bond together. As you stretch that protein, you reveal these places on that protein strand where they can form hydrogen bonds and where the gliadin can fit in and have these hydrophobic interactions along the strands. The strands then align and make these much thicker, ropier strands. Again, in this image, the starch granules have been removed by washing them away so we can see a little bit better the structure of the gluten that's being formed. So on the left-hand side, again, is some under-kneaded dough, and you can see that there's been a little bit of kneading, but these protein strands have begun to aggregate, and you can see some of the starch granules that have been washed away, but on the surface, but inside some of the holes you can still see some of the starch granules that are being trapped, that remain within the protein matrix of the forming gluten. And then as you continue to knead the dough, that gluten network goes from strands to forming real nice sheets of gluten where the protein is all lined up next to one another. We've mostly washed away the starch granules at the surface. As this dough bakes, those starch granules are going to absorb water and expand. So here's a little bit of a higher magnification. We can see really well kneaded dough that has the starch granules still in place, embedded down in the holes of the gluten that has formed. Those are going to absorb the water that's in the dough as it bakes, and the starch granules are going to hydrate, and as they hydrate, they're going to swell up much larger, filling the gaps and giving the dough some of the loft that you associate with typical dough. And we can see another view, a sort of exploded view under higher magnification, where these layers of gluten are lined one on top of the other, forming these membranes that are capable of trapping gas in, which when you bake the bread, the steam and the carbon dioxide that's coming off because of the yeast, the fermentation from the yeast, that gets trapped in these holes and gives the dough the crumb that's associated with baked bread, the holes that are inside, the bubbles that are inside of baked bread. All right. So, what are the different factors that affect the development and strength of different gluten, that different types of uh, manifestations of gluten? So, obviously, there's a lot of different types of baked goods. Everything from a cupcake and a brownie to a bagel to pizza dough and normal bread. All of these are the consistency of them are all dictated by various formations of gluten, right? The way the gluten, how strong it is, and how well it forms these membranous sheets. So the first of the factors, probably the most important factor that is going to affect the development of gluten, is what kind of wheat are you using? So there are two general categories. There's hard wheat and soft wheat, and there are a lot of different varieties of wheat berry on that spectrum. So hardest, the hardest of wheat is something that has a very high protein concentration. So there's much more gluten in. There's larger proteins that form much stronger, more cohesive, and elastic gluten. This is typically what you find in good bread flours. So like a hard red wheat berry is going to have more of these proteins in them. You can actually go to a specialty store and buy just plain gluten, vital wheat gluten, that can be added to your flour to make it more like bread flour if you're using just all-purpose flour, to give you a more desirable type of gluten formation if you're trying to make bread. Soft wheat, soft white wheat berries have much less protein, as little as 5%, between 5 and 10%. There's much less gluten in. They're smaller proteins. They form a much weaker type of gluten. This is the kind of thing that you would use in a cake. So if you think about the consistency in a cake or a cupcake, it's not that firm, strong dough, that stretchy, springy dough that you may associate with a piece of sourdough bread or something. Pastry flour is another type of flour that is somewhere on this continuum, a little bit closer to soft wheat than bread flour. Let's look at the anatomy of a wheat berry and see where the different components are coming from. So in general, we're going to break it down into three main regions in the wheat berry. There's the bran, the wheat bran, which is the hard outer covering of the wheat kernel, and it is got a lot of insoluble fiber, basically roughage, in it, and there's a lot of great B complex vitamins in it. So it's actually quite good for you having a whole wheat flour that includes the bran in it. Is a great way to get your B vitamins. And a great way to have the kind of roughage and the insoluble fiber that is important for a healthy gut. The second part is the wheat germ. And the wheat germ, you can think of the wheat germ as basically the actual seed of this. So the bran is the hard outer covering that protects it. The germ is the seed, sort of like the rocket capsule, where the spaceship, if it was a spaceship, that would be like the rocket capsule. And it's very nutrient rich. There's a lot of fats and B vitamins in there. And that is what is going to eventually sprout into a new wheat plant, is the wheat germ. And then there's all of the rocket fuel for that wheat germ to be able to grow, and that's the endosperm. That's the largest part of the wheat berry. It's about 80% inside the kernel of the wheat bran, and it's mostly made up of starch. This is what we use when we use white flour. White flour is mostly just endosperm, very starchy. Starch is a type of carbohydrate, very very nice product for making cakes and pastries. This is also where we get a lot of the proteins. Of course, I said the carbohydrates and the starch. There's a lot of iron, and there's B-complex vitamins in the endosperm as well. This is where we have a lot of the soluble fiber in the wheat berry. This is the fiber that goes into solution, can often be a little bit slippery. Yeah, the endosperm. So those are the three main parts of a wheat berry. The second factor that affects the development and strength of gluten is the amount of water that you use. So hydration is absolutely essential for the formation of gluten. Glutenin and gliadin absorb twice their weight in water through the process of hydration. And if you don't use enough water, you're going to have a inferior development of gluten because the proteins are not going to be as mobile. There's not going to be as much of an interaction for those proteins to interact with one another and form hydrogen bonds. But if you wash it out, if you add too much water, that can also reduce gluten development because you dilute the proteins that so much that their interactions are restricted, and instead of hydrogen bonding with each other, they are hydrogen bonding with the water that you have diluted the proteins with. So there's this sort of sweet spot in terms of hydration for the given outcome in terms of gluten formation. And that hydration is a continuum. You have different effects depending upon the exact amount of hydration that you're using for gluten formation. So that's what these diagrams here show. In low hydration, there's a close proximity of interactions, but there's no regular structure to the interaction between the proteins, the glutenin. And then intermediate hydration, sort of Goldilocks spot, we have loop formation, but there's a relatively low loop to train ratio. Train is where two adjacent strands of the glutenin are going to be interacting with one another. There is some water intercalated into the structure, but it's not the dominating presence. And then very high hydration, you're going to have a high loop to train ratio, and that gluten eventually in the vanishing point is not going to form particularly well. So some other factors, the particular properties of the water, how hard is the water, so any kind of solutes in there, calcium, magnesium in hard water are going to strengthen the gluten. So for example, the water in Boston, Massachusetts is very soft, containing only 0 to 60 parts per million of calcium and magnesium, and that can actually make that water a little bit harder, a little bit more difficult to use in the formation of gluten. The pH of the water is really important. So gluten, the ideal pH for gluten formation is around 5 to 6. Outside of that range, the gluten is going to go down in strength and become much easier to stretch. It'll become a harder, less hard, more stretchy, less tough dough. So oftentimes people will add baking soda to their baked good to make it more alkaline, to make the environment more alkaline, and that allows the cookies to spread and be more tender and not as tough as it might be in a bagel, for example. So there was an article that talked about the Goldilocks water for bagels and pizza crusts. You know, New York likes to think that it has the best pizza, has the best bagels. Is that because of the water in New York? Well, this guy, Kenji Lopez-Alt, wanted to investigate that, and he did a systematic double-blind taste test with various waters, and he said, Nope, actually, it doesn't. The difference between waters, so they used distilled water, various bottled waters, and then just tap water from New York. Had some artisanal chef come out and make a bunch of handmade pizzas, and then they had a double-blind taste test using these different waters to see if there was an effect, and they couldn't find any effect. They said the effect of hand making the pizza far outweighs the effect of water in terms of the quality of the dough that is formed and the consistency of the consistency of the gluten in that dough. Some other factors are leavening, so that means whether there's yeast. If there are yeast or microorganisms in your dough, they are fermenting and they're using up the starch granules in the dough, and they're releasing carbon dioxide. That carbon dioxide that's being released creates these expanding air bubbles. They continue to stretch and strengthen the gluten, aligning the fibers, making the bread more cohesive and elastic, but it also produces a much higher volume and a finer crumb in terms of the consistency of the bread itself. There are enzymes in flour that are going to naturally break the proteins down, but they're typically inactive when dry. So when you hydrate the dough, those enzymes break that gluten down into smaller pieces so the dough can become softer and more extensible. This whole process is what we call autolysis, and this is what happens when you rest dough for 15 to 30 minutes. You can either mix the dough up and bake it right away, or you can let it go through this autolytic process for resting the dough for a little bit. And this enables those enzymes, the proteolytic enzymes that are naturally present in the wheat flour, to break down the gluten and make the dough much more extensible, providing more volume and an open crumb. So this can be part of the rising process for the dough, like the second rise, the last rise. Some other factors are other things that you may add to the dough. So you can add salt and fat, oil, emulsifiers, and sugar. Salt is present in bread dough, about 2% of salt by weight. What the salt does is it's going to slow down this enzyme activity and the rate of fermentation. So it's also going to strengthen any gluten formation. So that's going to make a bread with a higher volume and a finer crumb, the more salt that is actually added into the dough. For example, that would be like the dough that you would find in a bagel. And we have a picture of the gluten network in a bagel. It's very dense. There's no oil or fat added to that dough, but there is quite a bit of salt in bagel dough. And we have a very dense, fine crumb, and the bagel expands a little bit because they're a little bit puffed up because of the salt formation. Whereas fats, oils, other emulsifiers, and sugar is all able to tenderize dough. So fat and emulsifiers are going to coat the proteins, reducing the hydration of the gluten and preventing gluten development, kind of like oil coating spaghetti prevents the spaghetti from sticking together. Shortening, the oil shortening, vegetable shortening, or lard, if it's from an animal, true to its name, shortens the gluten strands, producing more tender baked goods, and sugar is going to compete for water, so reducing protein hydration and gluten development. When you put a pie crust together, you're often keeping large chunks of butter, cold butter, or lard if you're using lard, or shortening. You're not mixing it uniformly throughout the dough. There's still big chunks of it. And as that dough bakes, it releases steam and leaves those void spaces that make the crust have these like flaky layers in them. Quite different than what we find in a bagel. All right, so there's a little bit of the science behind gluten and how it produces the types of baked goods that we all know and love. Tune in for the second part of this lecture where I stop rooting for gluten and I talk about some of the problems. Thank you. Bye.